Bill Koenig, such a distinguished person here tonight. In a career change in the summer of 1996, Bill began publishing Koenig's Watch, a weekly summary of important Middle East news from Dallas, which you'll find on the internet at watch.org. In January 2001, he moved the news service to the Washington, D.C. area and became a White House correspondent. In October 2001, he co-authored with John McTernan, Israel, The Blessing or the Curse. And then in February 2004, he authored Eye to Eye, Facing the Consequences of Dividing Israel. He writes a weekly 15-page news report called Koenig's Eye View from the White House that focuses on world news that is biblically relevant and White House news from a Christian perspective. So with that, Bill?
Thank you, Scott. Great to be with you all tonight, and this should be fun. Had a nice visit with Hussein Ibish and David as well, and we're going to find out a little bit more about each one's heart and the Palestinian and Israelis' hearts, Palestinian statehood, or Jewish homeland. And we're going to basically, I'll go ahead and do the bio here just shortly, but we'll start out with a 10-minute introduction from both of them, and then they'll have the opportunity to basically rebut or have some thoughts on the other person's introduction. So Hussein Ibish is a senior research fellow at the American Task Force in Palestine, and he's the executive director of Hala Salam Maksud Foundation for Arab American Leadership. Ibish has made thousands of radio and television appearances and has written for many newspapers, including the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, and the Chicago Tribune. He was a Washington, D.C. correspondent for the Daily Star. I've seen him on TV a couple times. He's very articulate, has a great understanding of the region, has a background from Lebanon. We've been talking about Lebanon, Syria, and just some really key areas that are around the nation of Israel. So this will be very interesting. He also recently wrote a book called What's Wrong with the One-State Agenda? Why Ending the Occupation and Peace with Israel is Still the Palestinian National Goal. From 1988 to 2004, Hussein served as the communication director for the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, the largest Arab American membership organization in the United States. And from 2001 to 2004, he was the vice president of the National Coalition to Protect Political Freedom. He has a PhD in comparative literature from the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. David Haviri immigrated with his family from New York to Israel at the age of 11 in 1978. He studied in Israel Academy, ACO, is it ACO? And served in the Israeli Defense Force. He lives with his wife and 8 children in the Israeli community of Kfar Tubak, and which is in northern Samaria. He has an extensive background in political activity, grassroots involvement. He has entered mainstream leadership of the Jewish settlements in Samaria. He has been featured in numerous documentaries, films dealing with issues that he's involved in. He also, along with the Canadian producer Yigal Hecht of Chutzpah Productions, film 35 Acres, explores the issues of the Temple Mount, the most contentious piece of real estate on the face of the earth. The Temple Mount is also, as we know, one of the most volatile areas in the city of Jerusalem. David has been involved in the Jewish side of the Temple Mount story for over 25 years. And he's also been interviewed by major media outlets, BBC, CNN, Al Jazeera, and others. David will start off with 10 minutes of his heart, and we'll share some things, and then following that, Hussein will come up, and then we'll start taking some thoughts from either side. So David, please come up.
Thank you very much, Bill. Thank you, everyone, for coming out. I got a tweet here a few minutes ago regarding this debate from someone who's been following the developments leading up to the debate, and he's being a little sarcastic, and he suggested that we start off the debate with the issue of God as a real estate agent. And I thought that would be an interesting idea, and just to pick up on that idea, and not in a sarcastic way, but in a very straightforward way, and to describe our motivation as a Jewish people to reestablish ourselves in the homeland, in our national homeland, in the land of Israel. The Torah, the Bible, there's a great commentator on the Bible whose name was Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki. And Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki starts out his commentary on all of the Bible on the first passage, the first verse of the Bible that says Bereshit. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And Rashi says that we know as Jewish people, the Bible for us is a list of instructions for us how to carry out our life. Within the Bible, we find the 613 commandments that the Jewish people are commanded by God to as a way of life. And Rashi asks a question. He says this verse, the creation of heaven and earth, is not a direction of a commandment. There's no direct commandment that's involved in that fact. And he said that the Torah, the Bible, should have started out from the beginning of the months, which is the first commandment. So he says, he asked the question, what is the reason that the Bible starts off telling us the story of creation? And Rashi there, and this is his first point of teaching of the Bible, he says, this is in order to tell you that God created the heavens and earth, and he can determine who each parcel of land belongs to. And he gave this parcel of land, the land of Israel, to the Jewish people. Now, Mr. Ibish may not subscribe to my faith and to my belief in the Bible. And I'm not trying to convince Mr. Ibish to agree with me because the Bible says so. But it's important to point out that is our motivation as a people, as the people of Israel, to reestablish our homeland, our country in the land of Israel. The nation of Israel had a country, a commonwealth, in the land of Israel for over 1,000 years. We had kings, we had government, we had 2 temples in Jerusalem. Our temple was destroyed some 2,000 years ago by the Romans, and we were exiled, we were forced off of our land. The people of Israel were forced off of the land of Israel. But for over 2,000 years, in every different location that the Jewish people existed, all spread out throughout the world, Jewish people every day promised to return to the land of Israel, to return to our national homeland. In synagogues like this one, on every corner of the earth, in every country, in Africa, in Asia, in Europe, in America, in Australia, everywhere, Jews would face Jerusalem 3 times a day and swear and promise and pray to Hashem, to God, to enable us to return to our land. We never gave up hope on that land. Our connection to the land, our national movement, the movement of the Jewish people, the national movement of the Jewish people that we call Zionism, began on that day that we were exiled from our land. Our national movement of return is based on our history, on our culture, on our religion, on our Torah, on our Bible. We read in the Bible of our fathers Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And relevant to the area, to the land, the region that I represent, the Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria, are the core of that national homeland. We learn about that in the Bible. Because all of the stories, all of the events evolving around our fathers Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all occurred in Judea and Samaria. Judea and Samaria is the core of our national homeland. When we read about Abraham, our father, who followed the calling of God, who said, "Go out from your land to a land that I will show you," and then the next passage tells us that he reached Shechem. Shechem is a city north of my home that the Arabs have dubbed over with a different name they call Nablus. Along the same road where Shechem is, we reach all of the other biblical locations: Shechem, Shiloh, Beit El, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Hebron, and Beersheba. All of the events of the Bible occurred there. Judea and Samaria, the area that is also considered the West Bank by the international community, that is the core of our national homeland. That's the heartland. The area that the international community are pressuring Israel to allow the establishment of an additional Arab country is the core of our national identity. The identity that kept us alive as a people for 2,000 years while we were in exile. That identity, the connection to our land that kept us together as a people, praying and believing and teaching our children that we would return to our land, we meant that we returned there, to the hills of the Samaria. A great miracle occurred, or many great miracles occurred, with the establishment of the State of Israel, with the regathering of the Jewish people who returned to establish our country in the land of Israel. In 1948, when the leaders of the Jewish people declared independence, we were attacked by 7 Arab armies who band together and declared that they would throw us in the sea. We succeeded in staying alive and surviving. A result of that war in 1948 was that the army of Transjordan, the other side of the Jordan River, crossed the Jordan River and occupied the West Bank. The West Bank historically only came about as a result of that war in 1948. If you look in books of history, you will not find the pre-1967 lines anywhere in history before 1948, because they only came about as a result of Jordan illegally occupying that area. I mean, talk about illegal occupation. Jordan's occupation of the West Bank was not recognized by the international community. There were only 2 countries in the world that recognized Jordan's claim on the West Bank: Pakistan and Great Britain. Even the Arab countries did not recognize Jordan's control of that area. Jordan occupied the West Bank for 19 years, up until 1967. Over the 19 years that Jordan occupied the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, and the city of Jerusalem, there was no effort by Jordan or by the other Arab countries to establish a Palestinian state in that area. In 1967, again, Israel was forced to protect itself from the aggression of the Arab armies, who again wished to band together to push the Jews into the sea. And a great miracle occurred. Israel, the state of Israel, took control of that area, of the heartland of Israel, of Judea and Samaria. And only after Israel took control of that area did the idea of establishing a Palestinian state in that area come about. Israel is a tiny, tiny country. The area that the state of Israel controls today is 1 divided by 800, the area that's controlled by the Arab Muslim world. The areas that the Arabs, our neighbors, all around Israel control is 800 times more than the state of Israel. The area that's called the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, is 30% of that one. The demands on Israel to shave away another 30%, the heartland, the center of Israel, could in no way change the situation for the Arab world. It's irrelevant. They have 800 times more as it is. But not only that, that area is significant for the Jewish people. That's the heartland of Israel. That's the area that we need not only because of our national identity, but also for our national security. The area of Judea and Samaria is the high ground of Israel. The majority of Israel's population are in the Tel Aviv area. 70% of the population of Israel are on the seashore. And the hills of the Samaria, where I live, look down on the buildings, on the homes, on the cities of Tel Aviv. Now we know that in 2005, the Israeli government, through the Oslo negotiations, agreed to give over the area of Gaza to establish the Palestinian Authority. Israel demolished all of the Jewish communities that existed in Gaza and displaced all of the Jewish residents who lived in the communities of Gaza, in Gush Katif. 10,000 Jewish people were forced out of their homes, their businesses, schools, and homes were all destroyed. In order to reach peace, if we examine the Israeli pullout from Gaza, if we see that as a test case, it was a test case that failed terribly. There was no positive result of Israel pulling out from Gaza. After Israel pulled out of Gaza, through democratic elections in the Palestinian Authority, the Hamas came into power. The Hamas, the Islamic fundamentalist terrorist organization, who have been using the same land that previously Jewish communities existed on, they're using those same sites to launch rockets into Israeli cities. How could we consider repeating that terrible mistake if, God forbid, Israel were to agree to the pressure, if, God forbid, Israel were to remove the Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria and give that area over to the Palestinian Authority? They would have the mountain ridge advantage. They would be looking down on the cities of Tel Aviv, and they could be threatening rockets into the cities of Tel Aviv. They could close down the Ben Gurion airport. Israel could not allow itself to put itself in such danger. There is no way that Israel could agree to establishing yet another Arab state in that small area that Israel has between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. That area must stay under Israeli control forever.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thanks for inviting me. And this is really a spectacularly beautiful space, is it not? I'm just enjoying looking at it the whole time. What David has given you is a very heartfelt, passionate explanation of the ideology and just a little hints of the theology of religious Zionism. And it's perfectly valid. It is a narrative. There was a lot of truth in what he said. There was some that it was tendentious and was exaggerated, some things that were. The important thing to understand, well, let me just first say, one of the most striking features was that he did not mention the word Palestinian in his entire conversation, which I think gives a window into the problem with the presentation that he gave you. He did not describe the problem that actually exists that confronts all of us, and he did not propose really any solution, as far as I can tell, except all this area must be under Israeli control forever. This is not a solution to the problem that actually exists, as I'll explain. But what is most important for you to understand is that there is a Palestinian narrative that is equally passionate, equally heartfelt, equally deep, equally intense, in many cases equally filled with religious fervor, with historical memory, with great fact. I will gladly acknowledge the deep historical ties and profound attachment of the Jewish people to this land. I would be a liar if I didn't. But anyone who does not also acknowledge the profound history and attachment and physical presence, uninterrupted physical presence, of the Palestinian people in the land of Palestine is also a liar. In other words, we have two people with deep histories in this territory and strong narratives, passionate beliefs, intense convictions. And I think I'm not going to give you the alternative version of what David gave you because it's pointless. It doesn't help us analyze the problem we face, and it doesn't help us solve that problem. I want to suggest a way of solving the problem. So, what is the problem? Well, the problem is that there are exactly the same numbers of people in this small area between the river and the sea of two separate ethnic and national groups, as they see themselves, as they define themselves. You have approximately 6 million Jewish Israelis living in the de facto Israeli state, Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, and approximately 6 million Palestinian Muslims and Christians in the same area. Of those 6 million Jewish Israelis, they are all citizens of the State of Israel with all the rights and responsibilities of citizenship, and they have their state and their independence and their enfranchisement and the miracle that David has described. Okay, now on the Palestinian side, you have a very different story. Approximately 1 million of those 5.5 or 6 million Palestinians are citizens of the State of Israel. They are subject to some forms of discrimination, but they also enjoy many of the rights and privileges of citizenship. It's an interesting situation, complex, etc. But the overwhelming majority, approximately 3.5 or 4 million Palestinians in the occupied territories, in East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip, are not citizens of Israel. They are not citizens of the state that rules them or any other state. They are stateless people. In fact, they are the largest number of stateless people anywhere in the world, especially most of whom are not refugees. They are living in their own country, yet they have no country to call their own. They are disenfranchised. And of course, it is true that the social and political and economic system that Israel enforces in the occupied territories is completely separate and radically unequal. It's quite without parallel in the world today. I'm not going to use derogatory, inflammatory, historical analogies about other times and places because I don't want to confuse the issue. Suffice it to say that what you can do if you're living in the occupied territories in terms of your daily life, from the minute you wake up until the minute you go to bed, is determined by whether the Israeli government classifies you as a citizen of Israel, and since almost no Arab citizens of Israel live in the occupied territories, we're talking here about settlers like Mr. Haivri here and his family, or whether they classify you as a Palestinian living under foreign military occupation. You live under two separate sets of laws. You live with two separate degrees of access to all kinds of resources, water, land, etc. The roads you can drive on, in many cases, are different. Whether you can move around freely without permission of a foreign army is different. Whether you can be armed for self-defense or not is different. Whether you can leave your country with a confidence of being allowed to return is different. Everything is separate and unequal. And particularly, there is this lack of citizenship, lack of statehood, lack of independence, lack of dignity, lack of self-determination. Now, this is the problem, because while there are these narratives, and this passion, and these religions, and this history, pain on both sides, suffering on both sides, massacres on both sides, all of this stuff, nonetheless, the fundamental reality is that you have a very large number of people who do not have statehood, citizenship, or independence. They live as non-citizens. They don't have their basic human or political rights. There isn't a single one of you in this room, not one of you, who would tolerate that passively in the long run. You wouldn't put up with it. And this actually, in spite, no matter how we frame the conflict and the narrative, is inevitably going to produce conflict. When you have that many people living in that condition for decade after decade, I mean, any Palestinian under the age of sort of 45 in the occupied territories knows nothing except life under occupation, has no memory of anything other than life under occupation. This is an untenable situation, and it's untenable in its structure. It's not because there's anything wrong with Israeli society or Israeli culture or Jewish religion that the Palestinians are in this situation. It's because Israel is the occupying power and these are the occupied people. It is nothing wrong with the Palestinian culture or whatnot that they seek to liberate themselves. It is inevitable. You could take this structural relationship and move it to Norway or Burundi or Burkina Faso or Japan, and you would end up with the same result. There would be a conflict because people would demand their rights. If you don't think they would demand their rights, I ask you, would you be happy to live with no citizenship and no vote and no freedom and nothing like that? You wouldn't. And if you sit there and tell me you would be happy to live that way in your own home, in your own village, in your own town, in your own country, I think you're being dishonest with yourself. So that's the problem. All right. The solution, I think there's only one, which is to have two states for these two peoples. In modern thinking, in the modern world, we understand that basically individuals have rights. Most rights accrue to people, as the Declaration of Independence says, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. These are held by the individual person. So individuals have rights that can't justly be denied to them, such as right to citizenship, right to vote, right to participate in their society, etc. Now, the intelligent modern mind also understands that there are collectivities, national groups, groups in large numbers with national identities that also have collective rights of self-determination. In my view, the Jewish people of Israel have a right to self-determination in Israel, in spite of the history of its creation, which involved the dispossession of the Palestinians. Yet it is what it is, and this is a situation we're in today. Israel is a member state of the United Nations. It is a legitimate country, and that is fine. But the Palestinians have the same rights. They have a right to self-determination. Now, David said something fascinating. He said, this little territory is irrelevant to the Arab world because look at the large size. It is not irrelevant to the millions of people who live there. And they live there not because they came from somewhere else, but because that is where they are from. And it is not irrelevant to them that their individual and collective rights are taken away from them. Palestinians don't forfeit their individual or national rights because they participate in a broader Arab culture, just as, say, the people of Belgium don't surrender their national and individual rights because they participate in a broader European culture. Or we could take a single state in the United States and it will take the rights of the people of Vermont away from them, but it's okay because there are 49 other states. This is silly. This is a kind of mystical thinking and mythical thinking and weird collectivist thinking that sees people in terms of chunks of humanity. The Jews, the Arabs. Remember, these collectivities exist, but they're made up of individuals. And those individuals have rights. And the Palestinians are not simply a generic group of Arabs. They have gone through a set of experiences in the 20th century as their identity, their national identity, which is exactly as old as the Israeli national identity and has been forged over the same period of time, is not synonymous with the national identity of the Lebanese, of the Jordanians, of the Saudis, of the Iraqis, of the, just because they're all Arabs doesn't mean Palestinian statehood is irrelevant to the Palestinians as a collectivity or that their human and national rights are irrelevant to them as individuals. So the only way out here is a two-state solution, which both people's individual rights and collective right to self-determination is expressed in two states. Otherwise, you're going to have a conflict over power between these ethnic groups. Now, one solution might be to have a single democratic state, like in South Africa, with everybody votes and there's no problem. This is unacceptable to almost every Zionist I've ever met because it would threaten the Jewish rule in the state of Israel because there is not a Jewish majority already. There's a Jewish plurality, but not a majority in that area. So that's off the table, and in fact I wrote a book about how silly the idea is. That's how wrong I think this thinking is among some Arabs. But equally the idea of a single state in which Israelis have full rights of citizenship and the Palestinians who live in the occupied territories have, I don't know, some kind of attenuated rights, some kind of personal rights but not political rights. Are we really not talking here about some kind of system that is bound to create yet another conflict? Are we talking about putting people in a situation where not one of you, not a single one of you, would agree to live under if you were subjected to it. So there is only one way out, which is to acknowledge the rights of everybody, both individually and collectively, and have two states living side by side together in peace and security.
Thank you. Before David's rebuttal here, after David's rebuttal and possibly Hussein's rebuttal as well, I'll have 3 or 4 questions and then give them some time to have rebuttals of each other's comments. And then I'll be taking some questions from the audience. So over the next 15, 20 minutes, if you have some questions, please jot them down on a piece of paper and they'll be brought up, and then I'll ask those toward the latter part of our debate tonight. Thank you both. David, your rebuttal.
I'd like to make a few comments, Mr. Ibish. I find it, I'd say, fascinating, the obsession with demanding rights in Israel while overlooking the general situation in the Middle East, and the obsession of comparing the situation with Israel and the situation in America or Belgium or so forth. Israel is in the middle of the Middle East and has not had I would say, any support or friendly relations from our neighboring countries through our history. But it's important to identify, to point out, and to see, to remember that the State of Israel was recognized by the international community as a Jewish country, as the Jewish State of Israel. That was recognized by the British, who promised to establish a national homeland for the Jewish people in the Palestine Mandate, the area that was appointed to the British as a result of the gains of World War I. The area was controlled by the Ottoman Empire before that. But not only Israel was established on the land that was obtained from the Ottoman Empire, there were 4 other countries that were also established, recognized by the international community: Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Jordan, countries that were not independent sovereign countries before World War I. People in general do not have an American style of rights and freedoms in any of those countries. The so-called Palestinians, and excuse me that I point that out, I don't mind. People can determine and call themselves whatever they like, and they can determine when their history began and when they would like to change the name of their nation. Before the establishment of the State of Israel, the people who today call themselves Palestinians consider themselves part of the Arab nation. And only later on did the idea of considering themselves a separate Palestinian nation evolve and so forth. But the same people who are the majority of the residents of the state of Jordan and live there as second-class citizens and are ruled by the Hashemite minority, I don't see the demands by the international community or by the advocates of the Palestinians for rights for the Palestinians in Jordan, who are the majority in that country. And there is a Palestinian state today. There's a state that has a majority of Palestinian residents, and that is Jordan. If the United States, for instance, which if the United States, for instance, will strongly subsidize the government of Jordan, would demand that Jordan hold democratic society and give full democratic representation to the residents of Jordan, then they could call the country whatever they please. They could call it Jordan, or they could call it Palestine. The main thing is that they agree to live in peace with Israel. The area has been divided. There is already a 2-state solution. The fact is that there's already a 3-state solution. The Palestine Mandate that was under the British control, that was promised to the Jewish people, was divided in the early 1920s. 2/3 of that area was given over to the Hashemites, who came from Saudi Arabia and were given the prize, because they assisted the British in World War I, to establish their own kingdom on 2/3 of the Palestine Mandate. At that time, the land was divided. That's the establishment of the first Palestinian state. The second Palestinian state was established in Gaza in 2005, when Israel pulled out and allowed the Palestinians to have self-determination and have their own general elections, and the Palestinians of Gaza decided that their representation would be the Islamic Hamas. I don't see any need for a third Palestinian state. I would expect people who fight for rights of peoples and are so concerned with the issues of the Middle East, which is so far away. I'd like to hear more about the massacre of the civilians in Syria, who are also being ruled by a minority dictator and have been for the past 40 years. Where are the activists speaking out on behalf of the people of Syria who have no rights, and the Palestinians who have lived in Lebanon for the past 60 years and are second-class citizens? But again and again, we hear the narrative, and it's all focused on Israel. Israel needs to solve the situation and give all of these rights to Palestinians, which would be the end of the state of Israel. I think that it's a basic right of the Jewish people to have our country in the state of Israel, and we happen to have the highest standard of living for Arabs and anywhere else in the Middle East. Arabs who are full citizens of the state of Israel earn the same benefits of any other Israeli citizens, and even Arabs who are non-citizens and live in the West Bank have a higher standard of protection and freedoms than you'd find in Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. So I think some credit is due on that. I suggest that the non-Jews who live under the Israeli control, whether they be Muslims or Christians or any other, show their loyalty to the state of Israel and be loyal citizens of the state of Israel, enjoy being part of that.
Okay, all right, that's fine. Please. That would be fine, of course, if that citizenship included the most basic right of citizenship, the right to vote. But it's not going to, is it, David? Because if the Palestinians in the occupied territories and the Palestinians who are citizens of Israel were all citizens of Israel and could vote, Salam Fayyad would be the prime minister of the state of Israel, or something like that. What we're talking about here is a rationalization based on history, theology, and all kinds of other ideological constructs for systematically denying millions of people their most fundamental rights in a systematic way. Now, when you talk about people not speaking out about human rights abuses in the Arab world, truly, you're talking to the wrong guy. Obviously, you don't read my writings. I've been extremely harsh on the Syrian regime, especially their manipulation of the Palestinian issue. And ATFP, 1 week from today, is holding a panel it's called Owning a Piece of Palestine, the Assad regimes and the Palestinian issue, which is going to examine the manipulation of this issue by the Syrian dictatorships. I have recently written about human rights issues in Bahrain, in Yemen, in Sudan. I certainly wrote a scathing article about Sudan. I mean, so you're talking the wrong guy. So put it back in your pocket and try it on the next guy, please. Credit where credit's due. I am not simply obsessed with the Palestinians, but there is a problem here, which is this conflict, as the people in this room show, has been invested in emotionally by millions of people all over the world. Here you are, you care. You care about this. And throughout the Muslim world, people care. And in Europe, people care. And in Latin America, people care. People really, really care about this conflict. This is not actually that big a conflict in terms of demographics and number of people killed and geographical size, compared to, say, the war in Congo, which has been the biggest war for most of the past 10 years. The war in Congo is contained in Congo. It doesn't have this extraordinary symbolic, religious, political resonance that the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians does. So this conflict needs to be resolved not just so that the Israelis and the Palestinians can live together in peace, which truly, under your scenario, there is no chance that they will do that, because the system you have laid out has been tried in South Africa. It was tried in the South in the United States during the Jim Crow era. And I think we know very well what happens in situations where one ethnic group tries to rule over another ethnic group without giving them the basic rights of citizenship, like the right to vote. You're quite wrong about the standard of living of Arabs in Israel. The per capita income, average per capita income in Qatar is over $150,000 a year. All right, just to give you one example. Now, that's a small country, but there are plenty of countries in the Middle East with higher standards of living than Israel, and certainly where Arabs have higher standards of living. But all of this is nonsense. All of this is smoke and mirrors. It's all either changing the subject or using some historical narrative to justify, or using some theological argument to justify, withholding basic human, national, civil, and political rights from millions of people. That's what we're talking about here. You can say Assad is a bad guy. I agree with you. You can say, well, there are problems all over the world. Robert Mugabe sucks. Okay, true. So, but how does that help solve the problem we are talking about here? If you wanted to have a panel on Syria, I would have been very happy to do it. My organization is having one in Washington in a week. You're all invited to come. But we're talking about Israel and the Palestinians. We're talking about specifically the occupied territories. And I think it's almost inconceivable to me that there is anyone who would be so self-deluded to think that millions of people are going to agree to live quietly without citizenship, without the right to vote, without other basic rights in perpetuity, voluntarily, and that's going to be fine with them. None of you would. I wouldn't. You wouldn't. You're prescribing this for other people. And I think it's mad to think that that could possibly be an acceptable arrangement to such a large group of people.
Okay, I will have a question for Hussein, and then David. Hussein, well, I'll start. David, I'm just going to mention what I'm going to talk to you about, and then I'll ask Hussein first, because this is a follow-up on what he's talking about. I'll be asking you about the American Jews and Israeli Jews that are pressuring the settlers, those that live in Judea and Samaria, to leave, and I'll get to you with that. But Hussein,
yes.
As mentioned, the day after Israel became a nation in 1948, they were attacked by 5 or 7 Arab nations, and they were into an immediate war situation.
Yes. They were in a war situation already, but I'll get to that.
Well, they had been for the 12 months up to that, but it became much more intense.
Yes.
But the main thing is the United Nations approved the State of Israel.
Correct.
And there was conflict prior to the 1947 partition agreement, and then they became a state May 14, 1948.
This is a very important point you're making.
But I want to build on this.
Yeah, but it's
crucial. And then in 1967, Assad of Syria and Nasser of Egypt told the world that they were going to drive the Jews into the Mediterranean and spill their blood in the soil of Israel. And Israel, as King Hussein said, Israel knew more about our 34 military facilities than we did. Israel prepared. They had a preemptive strike and were successful in the 6-day war. Shortly thereafter...
I don't accept that version of history.
Okay, well, that's okay. I
the quotes are wrong, but that's
okay. Well, there's a lot of history on this
exactly.
too. Okay, so the main premise here, okay, the 1973 in Yom Kippur War.
Yeah.
Israel was attacked during Yom Kippur by Egypt. Egypt wasn't able to defeat Israel militarily, so they agreed to the Camp David, the Camp David Accords, the Egyptian-Israeli peace initiatives.
That's better history. Yeah.
And then Israel had some other conflicts, 56, but I won't go into that.
Because Israel invaded.
Well,
Egypt.
you can throw that in if you want. But,
I'm not going to go into history. I'm really not.
Okay, but the thing here is Israel left Lebanon.
Yes.
And that void was filled by Hezbollah.
Exactly.
Israel left Gaza, and that there has been more weapons smuggled into Gaza the last 5 years than the previous 30 years.
Yes, this is very
And then also, just before that, we had Yasser Arafat receive this extremely generous offer in July of 2000 at Camp David. He had 94 to 95% of Judea and Samaria, East Jerusalem. But
no Palestinian heard that.
But he turned down this. But on CNN with Christiane Amanpour, he said specifically that she goes, "How could you not take this deal?" And he goes, "It has to do with the holy sites." And she,
this is
he got up and walked off the stage. So the main thing is you see a pattern. I mean, I think from this perspective, and I've got some tough questions for David as well.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah.
But the point here, Hussein, is you see a pattern here of Israel wanting. Israel's not perfect by any stretch, but the fact is they want to be left to live in peace and security, but they've had a difficult time with their neighbors and those that are living within inside of Israel.
You have established incontrovertibly that there is a conflict. That is the very first thing I said when I came to this podium. There is a conflict.
Right.
And I think the principal cause of it is apparent, and I've described that. There is a longer history that has to do with the struggle over land and power between these groups within that little area and the participation of larger states. There are some very important things you left out of your narrative, though. And I hate going back into history because it really doesn't help us that much, but there are some lessons we can learn. One is that Israel, in fact, has working peace agreements with Egypt and Jordan. And they're good peace agreements. The Israelis value them tremendously, to the extent that they were extremely nervous that the unrest in Egypt might threaten that valuable peace treaty, and it hasn't, and it's not going to. In my view, I don't see any Egyptian government breaking that treaty. They might, kick up a fuss, but they're not going to abrogate that treaty, not even if there's a Muslim Brotherhood-dominated parliament, and a very good peace treaty with Jordan. So what that tells you is that negotiations that are mutually respectful and reasonable between Arabs and the State of Israel are possible. Now, in both cases, it was predicated on Israeli withdrawal from territories occupied, and the Arab states recognizing Israel and full diplomatic normal relations with them. And this is the model that works. The model that doesn't work are the two that you cited. Israel's unilateral withdrawal from Lebanon, which was an Israeli decision made without any negotiation with anybody, for Israeli purposes, for Israeli intentions, and Israel's, what was called by Ariel Sharon, unilateral redeployment from Gaza, and not withdrawal. He never called it a withdrawal, and there's been a withdrawal to the periphery, but not a withdrawal from control of, essentially Gaza as a territory. And in that case, too, there was no negotiation. Nobody on the other side consulted. It was done by Israel for Israel's sake. It was something the Israeli military was pushing for at least 15 years, because it was a strategic drain on military resources to protect the 10,000 settlers that David was talking about. And there was an opportunity to do it. Now, in both those cases where there was a unilateral action, neither of them was in pursuit of peace. Let's be serious. There were military actions designed to promote some military goals. Where you have agreements between Arabs and Jews, the agreements stick. They work, they honor them. Everybody honors them because the people who made the agreements have a stake in making those agreements work. Where there are unilateral actions that are done by one party without any negotiations or any agreement on the other side, there's nobody on the other side who has a stake in making it work, so guess what? It doesn't work. So as I wrote a piece in the New York Times in January with Jeffrey Goldberg, in which we were talking about this issue, and we said we don't expect Israel to unilaterally withdraw from the West Bank. I'm not going to speak for him. What I expect is a negotiated agreement along the lines laid out by President Obama, anticipated in Security Council Resolution 242 and repeated continuously by the international community, negotiations between Israel and the PLO with land swaps leading to two states that can live side by side in peace. So if you had that, you would have a party on the other side, the Palestinians, who made that deal, the PLO in fact, the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people internationally, with a stake in making it work. They would have no incentive at all to do anything to jeopardize the process by which they achieved their statehood. It would be madness, and they're not mad. They are parties to a conflict which you went through a certain version of. Okay. The solution to the conflict is a negotiated end of conflict agreement, and that can only be predicated on two states.
Thank you. David, your rebuttal.
Well, Hussein, it seems to me that what you're saying is that if Israel controls areas like Lebanon, southern Lebanon, or Gaza, then Israel is to blame. And if Israel doesn't control the areas, then Israel is to blame. And that's more or less the narrative. Whatever it is, it's the Jews' mistake. Israel is an independent country and needs to control, needs to secure its borders, surely in borders where it has unfriendly neighbors. In the early 80s, Israel was forced to enter Lebanon in order to secure the northern border because the PLO, the Palestinians who so much wished to live with us in peace, were bombarding our northern towns with rockets and had established a state within a state in Lebanon after they were kicked out of Jordan for doing the same thing, for establishing a state within the state. And Israel came to the rescue of the government of Lebanon, helping them push out the PLO from their control. Thank you. And Israel had negotiated an agreement with the government of Lebanon, and the Prime Minister of Lebanon, Mr. Jamil, was assassinated by Syria, because in the Arab world, force is an accepted tool to enforce the situation of non-peace with Israel. So when you do have leaders who are willing and to be in peace with Israel, they put themselves in jeopardy.
You mean like that?
The Jewish people are a people who love peace and wish to live in peace, and have extended a hand for peace to our Arab neighbors from the beginning of the establishment, the return, the beginning of Zionism. The Israeli leaders and Jewish leaders have reached out to our Arab neighbors and asked to live in peace with them. And again, the response that we get is what we're getting in Gaza, and the threats that we're getting from Iran, and the threats that we're getting from the Hezbollah, and even the threats that we're getting from the PLO, who present themselves as moderates and are actually pragmatic, and refuse to recognize Israel as a Jewish state.
Thank you. As a matter of fact, the PLO recognized Israel formally in the Letters of Mutual Recognition in 1993. The Jewish state issue was never raised until 2007 in Annapolis. This is a new demand out of the blue, and it has no basis in the negotiating history. It's probably something that will have to be dealt with at some point in the negotiations, but it is a new idea, and every time the Palestinians turn around, they're told to recite a new magic formula. They have recognized the state of Israel. Israel is a sovereign state. It can define itself like every other state.
Okay, I've got two parts here for you, David. I'll give you one part now and then a follow-up with Hussein. But first of all, David, on this one, these are two parts to a relatively similar question. There are some vocal Jewish people in Israel and the United States, Thomas Friedman here with New York Times and others, and other vocal Jewish members of the J Street lobby saying that they believe that the settlers living in Judea and Samaria are directly responsible for the fact there hasn't been a peace deal. And the New York Times and LA Times, which has a very large Jewish readership, has said the same thing. How do you respond to that?
Well, first of all, I think that the demand that has become a part of the international discourse and appears in newspapers that are considered respectable, like the institutions that you mentioned, where they suggest, like the Palestinian Authority, suggest that the area of Judea and Samaria be cleansed of Jews, has become an acceptable claim. And if that claim was made anywhere else in the world, if we were to say that we could only live in peace and calm in Washington if no Jews lived here, or if no Arabs lived here, that would be considered outrageous. But here we have a certain community, it's my community, that the international community are suggesting that Jews be removed, like Jews were removed from Gaza, and not be allowed to live there, and are blaming the Jews who live there for all of the wrongs in the world. This is the areas of Judea and Samaria are the core of our national homeland. It is our right to live there, and we are not to blame for a non-peace. The claim that there could only be peace if we weren't there is totally outrageous.
Okay, I think that's fine. I think that's a perfectly reasonable observation. But just let me say, on your question, these critics of the settlement movement, at least when it comes to David, are quite right. Obviously, he has said so. He's not in favor of a peace agreement with the Palestinians. He made that abundantly clear in his opening remarks. So if they say there's a problem there, he has given them every proof of their assertion. Now, let me just say vis-a-vis the future of the settlers. First of all, the whole concept of land swaps, which has been agreed by the Palestinians in principle since the negotiations began in '93, which is part of the roadmap, which is part of the Obama parameters, accepted by everybody who's serious about negotiations, is in order to accommodate large settlement blocks. It is there because of the settlements. I mean, you know, it is actually going through an incredible gyration to accommodate places like Ma'ale Adumim and things like that. The international community is actually bending over backwards to allow Israel to do something that the UN Charter says is totally inadmissible. That is to say, the acquisition of territory by war. Although in this case, it would be through an agreement. And the Palestinians have said they are willing to do that to some extent in order to facilitate a peace agreement. So nobody is calling, nobody, except for anti-peace fanatics, are calling for the removal of all the Jews from the occupied territories and the settlements. Now, the Palestinian position on Jewish settlers who remain in what will become, hopefully, if we're to have a peace ever in this situation, a Palestinian state, is not as you've represented. Prime Minister Fayyad has said many times that Jews should be welcome to stay in the Palestinian state as residents, as citizens, or dual citizens. He's said that.
How often does he say that in Arabic in Ramallah?
He has said it many times in Arabic. And Abu Mazen has said similar things in Arabic and also on Israeli TV, on Channel 2 as well. So these two men have said this. Now, there are many different formal positions. There are many different leadership positions. Ultimately, this is a subject for negotiations. I think it is imperative that the Palestinian state be open to Jewish residents. I think it is imperative that Jews be allowed to live in the Palestinian state as residents or citizens or dual citizens or anything. It is a very important value for Palestinian society. And so on that, we agree. But turning around and asking the Palestinians to have no rights, no votes, no citizenship to accommodate the settlement project is just, it's unrealistic. It will, Madam, if you have a question, write it down.
Okay.
Do we
okay.
Really, is this?
No.
Is this appropriate?
No.
I don't think so either. So if I could finish.
But,
I was about to finish.
yeah, please write down the question. We'll get to it.
You know, apparently she's very upset that I say that I think Jews should be allowed to stay in the Palestinian state.
Well, okay, let's go on here.
You know, it becomes impossible at some point to some people won't take yes for an answer.
Okay, Hussein, I got a question here. The Palestinian leadership. There's been a lot of questions. There's been a tremendous amount written about Yasser Arafat and his history of negotiations. Yeah. A tremendous amount of money that has been given to that was given to Arafat. Yep. They alleged that a large portion of that money did not get to the Palestinians in need.
That's true.
And it went out of the country, and that was part of the reason that Hamas was able to move into a position of influence, because they met some of the social needs that really should have been met with the funds that the EU and the United States provided to the Palestinians.
Well, or by Israel, the occupying power, one or the other. I agree. So I agree with your basic premise. Yeah.
Okay, so I think that's part of the problem, and part of the lack of trust by the international community is Arafat, and then one other point here is the fact that Arafat, as we mentioned, turned down a tremendously generous offer in 2000, and then Abbas had the opportunity when Ehud Olmert was in office to have relatively pretty much the same deal given or provided to Abbas, but again...
they were very different. No, the history of the negotiations is very complicated. Camp David was Rashomon, if you're familiar with the Kurosawa film, where every character has a completely different recollection. Nothing is in writing. There are no documents. So there's no definitive record of what happened there. Even the Americans who were there all have a different account of what was on offer at Camp David. Dennis Ross has one version, Aaron Miller has another version, Rob Malley has another version, all Jewish Americans, I might add.
What's a significant difference?
Well, I mean, there are people who will say, Shimon Peres actually at one point said, we offered them 100% of the occupied territories. That's preposterous. You know, the Palestinians believed they were being offered a state which was broken up into numerous bifurcated cantons that would have extreme limitations on its sovereignty, that would have Abu Dis, which is a suburb of Jerusalem, as its capital, but not anything actually inside Jerusalem, and that it just didn't meet the minimum requirements. However, the two sides kept talking. They didn't walk away from the negotiating table, and they came closer in Taba. And then I think you're right, Abbas and Olmert came even closer, which shows that if we keep negotiating, we probably can get there because we have been continuously getting closer. So the goal we should all have, if we're responsible people, is help the Israelis and the Palestinians, and especially the leaders, particularly Prime Minister Netanyahu and his cabinet, and President Abbas and the rest of the PLO leadership, give them the political support and the political cover to go back to the negotiating table and try to achieve an actual deal. Now, on the question of corruption, you're absolutely right. Arafat was not personally corrupt, but he ran a corrupt system. No, he was not. Look, either you know or you don't know, okay, basically. The man lived a simple life, but he oversaw, if you will listen to me, you will learn something you don't know, he oversaw a corrupt structure. Okay, in other words, there was a patronage system. You know, laughing at the details of the truth that is actually a painful truth that I'm telling you is not a very intelligent thing to do. He ran a patronage system which was based on quotas, okay, so that everybody in different Palestinian organizations needed to get their little piece. It was essentially a very corrupt system. And this is what I'm trying to tell you, and you're snickering, all right? Now, there was this legacy inherited by Abu Mazen and by Salam Fayyad. What Fayyad has done, first as finance minister and then as prime minister, and by the way, it's crucial to understand that Fayyad had never been a member of the PLO or of Fatah, is to establish, among many other things, a clean public finance system. It's one of the cleanest in the Arab world, actually. So that now foreign donations that go to the treasury are very transparently distributed, okay? Now, that's one of the reasons why there's such an international concern about somebody else becoming prime minister of the Palestinian Authority, because Fayyad has created this transparent system and he's trusted. There are other sources of money, Palestinian money in the occupied territories, that are not fully cleaned up yet. The money that the PLO has income from other places that is still subject to the quota system and some of the kinds of corruption that I was talking about. But enormous progress has been made, and everybody acknowledges this. The World Bank, the IMF, the UN, the United States. In the past, Congress would give aid to the Palestinians. It was all dedicated to NGOs for specific projects. It was not given to the Palestinians. It was given to Western or American companies and NGOs that would do projects for the Palestinians. Increasingly, it has been it's becoming almost entirely cash treasury-to-treasury transfers, because even people in Congress who are not very friendly to the Palestinians, you might have noticed, have understood that the system run by the treasury, by the formal treasury overseen by Prime Minister Fayyad, is a clean system. The Saudis know this too. So you're right, there's a legacy of corruption. It did help Hamas, who are as corrupt as anybody else, but they never had their hands on government, so it wasn't known that they were. It did help them rise to power, but there's been a huge amount of progress under the current leadership, and it would be really bad to squander that.
David, rebuttal.
Well, it's just interesting, the infrastructure and the corruption that you've been speaking about in the Palestinian society regarding the management or mismanagement of funds, and the call for democracy, but on the other hand, the international community has imposed a dictator who's the prime minister of the PA, Mr. Fayyad, who was not elected by his own population, but the international community did not trust the population of the so-called Palestinians to manage the funds that he was elected and his mandate is passed very long ago, as well as Mr. Abbas. but the other forces are keeping him in power because they do not trust the people who they're administrating the funds for. And so here we have a community that's not trusted by the international community who are funding them, and still pressure is being placed on Israel to put trust in this community who does not recognize Israel as a Jewish state, doesn't really recognize Israel at all, as you can see in the textbooks and the television and kids shows and so forth, and the Palestinian Authority, who have other ideas regarding all of Israel, who they would like to see as Palestine.
You know, can I just say one very quickly? What we have here is a great asymmetry, because I'm willing to tell you some hard truths about Palestinian history and Palestinian culture and society. And what David is giving you is a black and white narrative where there are goodies and baddies. Israel, wonderful country, always wanted to live in peace, never did anything wrong, hand extended in friendship from the beginning, great, wonderful, perfect, excellent. The Palestinians, so-called Palestinians, corrupt, awful, horrible, crazy, goodies and baddies. Anyone over the age of 3 should know that this is silly. I mean, come on. These are real human beings in large numbers in a conflict. Nobody behaves well. If you're looking for clean hands, you're not going to find them. Okay, and I invite all of you to join me in the adult world, where there's a lot of good and a lot of bad in everybody.
One other thing, before I get back to David, Hussein, I'd just like to get a little clarity here. There has been talk, the U.S. is, some people have said the U.S. is supporting the upgrading of the Palestinian Authority to a status of an independent state. When the Palestinian Authority has promoted arch terrorists by naming streets, squares, and soccer tournaments after them, as well as promoting hate education via its schools, media, and mosque systems. This isn't exactly conditioned for peace.
Yeah, well, actually, that's totally wrong about the PA, because it's received very little coverage. One of the things that the Fayyad government has done over the past few years, and it's been very risky and very controversial, has been fire a very large number of teachers, Hamas-oriented teachers from the PA public school system, and fire a whole bunch of Hamas-oriented preachers from West Bank mosques. And they don't like to talk about it because it's unpopular, it looks undemocratic, you know, all this stuff. And in an independent state, it would be undemocratic, but they don't have the luxury because they don't have, you know, a system of control because they're not independent. So they've been put in a position of having to crack down on people who say dangerous things. And as a matter of fact, they've done it, and they've done it in a very credible way, in a serious way. Is there work to go? Sure there is, but I mean, the amount of incitement in Israel against Palestinians is also quite significant. I cite only the King of the Torah scandal, which is going on now, as a very serious matter.
One question here on the follow-up there.
Oh, sure, but what was your...
Well, Fayyad's receiving a tremendous amount of...
The UN you wanted to ask about, right?
Yeah, but the main thing here is the Fayyad's received a lot of credit for really doing a good job. And it sounds like, well, he's doing a decent job. The Palestinian economy is improving. There seems to be a level of respect for the most part for what he's done.
Without doubt.
But you've also mentioned
including
here,
in Israel.
You've also mentioned here that Fayyad's having a lot of influence over this rhetoric that's coming out of the Palestinian Authority. So the question is there a tension now between Hamas and Fayyad, and do you see a significant tension? Well,
oh yes.
Could you give us some details?
Oh yes. Well, if, it was last year, there were a few months when the main poster in Gaza was Fayyad as a vampire eating children. They can't stand the man because he's one of the few political leaders in the Arab world who's willing to denounce Islamism in the strongest possible terms. I mean, this is a retrograde sort of way of thinking. He says, you know, we have to, he gave a speech last August, almost a year ago, in which he said he wanted to use the public education system in the West Bank to combat what he called religious and political fanaticism, and he gave the example of men and women not shaking hands with each other, which he said is not based in Palestinian culture and tradition, which it isn't, and not based in traditional Islam, which it isn't, and is some kind of imposition by fanatics, which it is, and he said we need to use the education system to combat this. He was immediately accused by Hamas of wanting to promote pornography in schools and corrupt the youth and promote pedophilia and all. I mean, they just went nuts, because it was hitting them where they live. You know, their main goal in life is like the other the Islamists, is to Islamize their society along religious lines. Like a lot of religious extremists, their principal goal is to make everyone around them equally, who is part of their faith, equally extreme in their religious views. So Fayyad opposes that, and it's very interesting. About the UN, I actually think it's clear the US will veto a Palestinian UN membership application in the Security Council. And a confrontation on this issue with the United States is not in anybody's interest. There are a number of ways we can avoid that confrontation that will not serve anybody's interest. And if anybody's interested in them, I'll explain it, but I'll just simply say that it's important that we find a different way forward.
Okay, these two questions for David and you, Hussein, are going to be about the leadership of both governments.
Sure.
David, there's been a lot of stress inside of Israel and outside of Israel for supporters of Israel that the Peace Now activists in Israel, also the very vocal opposition in the Knesset led by Zippy Livni, the Kadima leader, and also a majority of Israel's media, and also a lot of the media in the United States believes that for some reason, for some people that are very pro-Israel, believes that there is a lack of a full understanding of the potential danger to Israel in the event that a peace deal is made with a Hamas-led government. Could you give me some details, and I'll ask Hussein for his perspective on the Israeli leadership that he's dealing with.
So elaborate a bit, I didn't understand.
The main question here has to do with there is a tremendous amount of stress that you see in Israel and read in Israel that the Peace Now activists, the opposition led by Zippy Livni of Kadima, and also the media in Israel is really putting a tremendous amount of pressure on Netanyahu to make a deal. Do you think... Because they believe now's the time to do it. They believe now's the time to do it with the conflicts on Israel's border, some concerns about Egypt politically, Syria, Lebanon politically, that it would serve Israel's best interest right now to make a peace deal. But it seems like they're forgetting the potential security issue that they might have by having an Iranian-backed Hamas leadership inside of Judea and Samaria.
Hard ball.
I think that there's a lot of good intentions by naive people who are, we all wish for peace. All Jewish people want to live in peace, and all Israelis want to live in peace. The issue is the price that is being negotiated, the price of dividing the state of Israel and establishing an additional Arab country in the heartland of Israel is a price that Israel cannot allow itself to make. And those parties who are pressuring Netanyahu, some of the parties that you mentioned, the Israeli Peace Now organization and other such like-minded organizations who are highly funded by external or external governments, by the European Union and other highly interested organizations that are not thinking of Israel's interest, are pressuring Israel to give in now because they're concerned that the leadership that come into the PA in the future might be more difficult for them to negotiate with, or impossible to negotiate with, and they're right. The PA in Judea and Samaria have delayed the municipal elections for nearly 3 years because they know, and this is documented, they know that the Hamas would win those elections. They couldn't win the elections in Gaza with all of the international support that the PLO received to win those elections. And these organizations who are pressuring Israel's responsible government to be irresponsible are doing that because they know if we don't do it now, if we don't give over Judea and Samaria now, we might not be able to give it over later. And the whole concept, the Oslo process, has proven itself to be a terrible mistake, definitely for Israel, but for the Arab population of those areas as well. The conditions of the Arabs in Gaza has decreased greatly by Israel's pulling out, and other areas that in the northern Shomron that Israel has removed its communities. The whole concept is a great mistake. The idea, the concept of land for peace is a great mistake. We need to offer peace for peace. Israel is a nation that can protect its borders. Israel is a nation that wishes to live in peace with its neighbors, and our neighbors need to recognize Israel, to recognize our borders, to recognize the Jewishness of the State of Israel, and to accept us as a friendly neighbor, and we would all benefit from that. Yeah. Surely Israel would benefit, and surely our neighbors would benefit from that. And it would be a good idea at this point, after seeing all of the mistakes, all of the tragedies that have come because of this terrible Oslo process of giving over land and recognizing the PLO and establishing the PA. This all needs to be turned around, and a new concept needs to be brought forward, offering peace. Let's live in peace.
Well, you cannot live in peace with millions of people if you deny them citizenship, human rights, voting rights, and basic, not only their basic individual liberties. That is not going to happen. People don't work that way. No group of people in the world does. That's not offering peace for peace. That's offering oppression for peace. Okay, let's be honest about it. All right, that's exactly what it is. To be honest, I just don't know how you think that millions of people are going to go along with that. You wouldn't. Simple as that.
Hussein, you've given us a perspective of the Palestinian leadership and the challenges that they're facing right now, which isn't unique to a lot of countries in the world.
It's remarkable.
There is a leadership problem. Who would Israel, or who should Israel look to as their peace partner with the Palestinians?
There's no doubt. Well, there's no question. From a legal, diplomatic, and political perspective, this is not in doubt. The PLO is the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, according to every single international, Arab, Palestinian, UN, any document you want to look at. There is no document internationally that says anything other than that. And specifically, in the letters of mutual recognition, the letter from Chairman Arafat to Prime Minister Rabin recognized the State of Israel and its right to live in peace and secure borders without threats of violence and anything like that. Prime Minister Rabin's letter to Chairman Arafat, which was in this dreadfully lopsided arrangement, was simply to recognize that the PLO was the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, not to recognize the Palestinian state or even the Palestinian right to statehood. So for 20 years, almost 20 years, we've had one people recognizing the other people's not only right to statehood, but state, and no reciprocation. But what it does mean is that clearly from the Israeli point, Israel is committed by treaty to negotiating with the PLO and nobody else. And this is reflected. I can't name anyone whose position deviates from that.
The PLO leadership of Abbas and Fayyad?
I'm talking about Abbas. Yeah. Abbas is the chairman of the PLO.
Right.
Fayyad is the prime minister of the PA, which is the government on the ground, ministries, which runs things in the autonomous.
What about this coalition agreement now between Hamas and Fatah?
Very interesting, actually, between Hamas and the PLO. And what they did is, it contextualizes for a second. In most of the Arab uprisings, the demand has been for the removal of heads of state or for regime change or for reforms or democracy. Among the Palestinians, the demand was for national unity, because the feeling was all that other stuff comes after independence. That we need our independence and therefore we need to be united, and having this split between the West Bank and Gaza is crippling the ability of the movement to seek independence. So that's what people were asking for. The parties both felt pressured by that. Fatah lost a very close friend in Mubarak. Hamas fell out with al-Assad completely. I mean, they're not on speaking. They don't have a tenable long-term situation in Syria anymore, since the Muslim Brotherhood is a core part of the coalition that is trying to unseat Mr. al-Assad. So their long-term future there is, and where are they going to go? Sudan? That would be to announce your own irrelevancy, I think, permanently. They all felt pressure, and especially pressure from the Palestinian people for unity. And their answer was to agree to agree. But the agreement is an agreement to make an agreement. They actually have not agreed on anything, not a single thing. They can't, not one element of the relationship between Fatah and Hamas has changed in months, and it's not going to. And I said from the beginning, you cannot fit the square peg of Hamas rejectionist policies, which I hear an echo of across the other side of the aisle here. We don't make a deal, this belongs to us, this is our thing, our religion, our history, our culture, blah, blah, blah. I hear it over there, and I hear it from them too. Into the round hole of the PLO's approach of negotiating a peace agreement with Israel or securing independence in this very small part of historical Palestine, 22%, or even a little less maybe, through diplomacy, through nonviolence. Abbas, when he was elected president in 2005, ran on a strict campaign of nonviolence, and everybody acknowledges that Abbas and Fayyad have done what they could with the resources they have in the small areas they operate in to restrain that kind of violence. So, I mean, I think that there's no doubt who Israel should negotiate with and why they should negotiate with them. And truly, I have a very hard time imagining what David sees when he thinks about what Israel and the occupied territories will look like in 50 years' time if he gets his way. There will undoubtedly be an Arab majority in that area. There will undoubtedly be a huge tension. We have had two long experiences with the kind of single state that he advocates as a permanent solution. One was the British Mandate, which led to civil conflict and finally the civil war that began in November 47, and then ultimately the creation of Israel and the Nakba of the Palestinians and all that stuff. And then the other has been the occupation, which has led to the first Intifada, the second Intifada, Cass-led, and I will assure you, further conflicts down the road if we cannot come to an agreement. Not because I want them, I dearly do not want them, but because I believe it's inevitable that when millions of people are subjugated in this most extraordinary, most unprecedented way without even being citizens. I mean, it's not second-class citizens or suppressed citizens or citizens living under a tyrannical government. They're not even citizens at all.
Okay, thank you. If you have some questions, would you raise your hand and we'll have somebody pick those up. Let's see, we need somebody to help pick those up. Tommy, can we get somebody? We got 4 or 5 here, and I'll try to get through these pretty quick. I have one more question for David that'll go right to your questions. David, the quartet met in the last week. The EU, the UN, the United States and Russia met at the U.S. State Department. And they had a meeting, and everybody was surprised that they didn't come out with any kind of communique. Thank you. As far as what happened at the meeting, they usually have a statement. EU's Foreign Minister Ashton was here saying there were some differences. Hillary Clinton said there were some differences. The Russians said they aren't comfortable with Netanyahu's requirement that the Palestinians acknowledge that Israel's a Jewish state. With all that said, there was also some articles, I guess it was in Jerusalem Post, the fact that Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu, is now more along favoring Barack Obama's 6-day border, 67 6-day borders with some agreed to land swaps, but he's going to require that the Palestinians acknowledge this Jewish state and the possibility of a demilitarized Palestinian government. What is your perspective, having lived in Samaria, of what has happened recently politically? Because I know you all watch this very closely.
My own perspective is that it seems to me that there are a lot of high-profile people from around the world who are spending a lot of time throwing around a lot of ideas and ignoring the facts on the ground. And the facts on the ground are that the Jews are back. We have returned to our homeland. They can negotiate between each other and against each other and suggest to Israel and pressure Netanyahu and so forth. And they can try to pressure Netanyahu to impose building restrictions on the Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria and forbid us from building, adding on a room to our home and forbid us from building a new kindergarten. But the fact of the matter is that our population, the Jewish population in the Samaria and the communities that I represent, is the fastest growing Jewish community in Israel. And we're going to continue building our homes, planting our trees, raising our children. We have returned to our homeland. We prayed for 2,000 years to return to our land, and we are back. We're not going. We're not leaving again.
I've said I don't think it should be required to.
I
thought you were done. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I suggest to Mr. Ibish to advise the Arab leaders who he communicates with to point out that the Jewish people, the so-called settlers of Judea and Samaria, are determined. We're back. We are staying there. That is the heartland of the land of Israel. That is our home. Another Arab state will not be established there. So all of this talk, we'll talk and talk and talk,
No.
but at the end, this will remain a united part of the state of Israel.
I have to say, I think that I would hear exactly the same rhetoric from a member of Hamas. He would say the same exact thing about Palestine. He would refer to Haifa and Jaffa and these places with equally powerful resonance, and above all Jerusalem, to the Palestinians, whether Muslims or Christians. You would get the same rhetoric, and they would say, we are here. We have never left. We're not going anywhere. You say, we're back, and indeed you are. And they say, well, we're not going anywhere, we've never left. And indeed they are. And guess what? Right now there are equal numbers of you. But the trend is rather in their favor. And so if you take this attitude that this land is mine, which is also the attitude of Hamas, that's who you're going to end up dealing with. And apparently you're happy to fight this out to the last child. And I find that deeply immoral. We need to have a reasonable peace agreement where people have their basic national and human rights. That's if you don't do that, you're sentencing yourself and your family and all of us and everyone to an ongoing bloody conflict, because the system that you're proposing deprives millions of people of the right to citizenship, the right to vote, the rights that we all expect and demand, the rights that not a single person in this room would agree to be deprived of voluntarily. And in the end, you would fight for them.
Okay, I've got some questions here. I've got some long questions.
Did you distill them?
I'll go with some of the
Pick a representative sentence.
Okay, here's an interesting one. You hear this from time to time. The city of Jerusalem is mentioned 800 times in the Bible, about 660 times in the Old Testament, 200 or 140 times, 142 times in the New Testament. But it's not mentioned in the Quran.
Right, irrelevant. This is not a religious conflict. This is not about religion. This is not a conflict about religion.
But,
the Palestinian movement is not and has not been an Islamic movement. It has had many Christian leaders. The Palestinian people are not dominated by religious fanaticism. There is a minority movement, Hamas, which is very dangerous, which is mirrored by the religious fanatics in Israel, who also have a all or nothing attitude. And certainly there is a religious argument on the Islamic side, and indeed a religious argument among the Palestinian Christian side for, well, this all belongs to me. Jerusalem is mentioned, not mentioned. We were here, you left, you weren't there. It's not true, it's true, whatever. Look, the fact is the reality that exists today. David makes a good point when he says, listen, we're here. You're right, you're there. And you're a reality you have to be dealt with, no doubt. Well, so are the Palestinians. And saying, well, something is mentioned in the Quran more than the I believe that the Virgin Mary is mentioned more in the Quran than she is in the Bible. What kind of nonsense is this when we try to take ancient holy books and try to apply them to present realities where there are millions of people who live in places where they have rights because they are human beings? There is a conflict here between a modern mind which sees people as human beings and also national groups with both human and collective rights, and a medieval attitude that looks at the world through holy texts and symbols and signs and abstractions and all this stuff. There is a conflict between medieval thinking and modern thinking. Okay. And we have it, believe me, among the Arabs. Okay? But I'm hearing a lot of it right now today as well. Okay. And modernity is better than medievalism.
Okay, thank you. David, there's been a lot said about the plight of Jews throughout the Arab countries for many, many years. And a lot of them have been forced to leave, Iran, Iraq, Libya, Egypt, many other countries. What do you have to say about that?
Another hardball. Really tough question.
It's very relevant.
It's relevant, but it's very tough. He's going to have a hard time with that one.
Let's see what he does.
The State of Israel was established in 1948. In the early years, the first 2 years of the establishment of the State of Israel, the country absorbed nearly 1 million Jewish refugees from Arab countries. All of this talk about rights and people deserve rights and so forth, the Arab countries, the countries in the Middle East award no rights to Jewish people. Jewish people have no thoughts of even suggesting, demanding any compensation from the countries that they were expelled from or that they fled from the violence in all of the Middle Eastern countries. The Jewish people have no rights in the countries around Israel, even the ones we have treaties with. In Egypt, Jordan, and the Palestinian Authority, Jewish people have no rights. Citizens or residents of those countries are forbidden from selling land to Jewish people in any of those countries. A Jew cannot buy land from an Arab or Muslim in the Palestinian Authority, and an Arab in the Palestinian Authority who dares sell a piece of land to a Jewish person could be killed by the Palestinian Authority for doing that. There's no equality in the Middle East, and the demands of Israel are not in line with what is accepted by the international community in the region. So it's time to recognize the fact that the Arab countries in the Middle East all expelled or caused their Jewish population to become refugees, and Israel absorbed all of those Jewish refugees. Not one of them today lives in a tent or is without work or without citizenship. The Arab world needs in return to recognize the immigrants, the migrants who moved into their countries as a result of the same war, and give them citizenship in their own countries.
Well, I actually agree with that. For sure, the Palestinian refugees, and without question, the Palestinian refugees should be given citizenship. And the biggest problem of the Palestinians is really in Lebanon. It's about 250, 300,000 people who live under the most deplorable conditions. And I am a dual citizen of the United States and Lebanon, and I've complained bitterly about this in Arabic, on Arabic, etc., and in other forums. So I'm no slouch on that issue. However, Jordan, in fact, does grant the Palestinians. It's the biggest group of Palestinians outside of Palestine are in Jordan, and they have citizenship, and they've had every single important job in Jordan except Queen, but except King, but including Queen now.
That's right.
But
let me ask you this.
But there are restrictions. It's hard for them to get into the upper echelons of the military and the secret police. What I want to say about the Jews from Arab states in Israel is that there are a lot of very sad stories here, and there is a lot of appropriately shame attached, I think, in the Arab narrative to some of what happened. And it's very important that as Israelis acknowledge the dispossession of Palestinians, their forced expulsions in many cases, and their refusal to be returned to their homes, that Arabs also understand that Jews suffered. However, many Jews in Israel of Arab origin get very upset, including members of the Knesset, get very upset when they hear this, because they say, I came here to make Aliyah, I'm a Zionist, I'm here of my own free will, and this migration was greatly encouraged by the Israeli state, and from a Zionist and Israeli point of view, it was the realization of the purpose of the State of Israel. Now, the opposite is true of the Palestinian refugees. It was the destruction of an extant society that took another 20 years after to even start forming its national organizations again, its national institutions. So while there is certainly some pain on both sides, there is the story of the Jews from the Arab world in Israel is much, much more complicated than that of the Palestinians, and its political significance is reversed. It is the realization of a national project, not the destruction of a national project, and you really have to understand that to understand the significance of it.
Well, you mentioned something very important here, is the fact that the Arabs and Palestinians, however you want to put it. I guess, well, let me put it this way. I'll put it into context.
It depends which Arabs you're talking about.
Right. Well, in 1940, right after the Israel became a nation, the next day they were attacked by 5 or 7 Arab nations. And
there was a large intervention in an ongoing civil war.
And for the most part, we understand that the refugee situation was Arabs that lived there in Palestine at the time. There was Israeli Arabs, or there was, Jewish from Palestine. There was Arabs from Palestine.
Correct.
And they had them leave.
Yes.
And they are now, and a lot of people are concerned about that the Palestinian people have been pawns in this peace process, and as you alluded to in Lebanon,
the war process
they've
by
been
the Arabs,
treated as
yes.
second and third class citizens and living in refugee camps.
Especially in Lebanon. Yes,
Yeah.
I think it's true that the Palestinian issue, and to some extent the Palestinian refugees, depending on where, have been pawns of many different people's politics. Certainly, for example, if you look at the way the Syrian regime, both under Hafez al-Assad and his son, have exploited this issue to essentially gain credibility by being ultra-nationalistic and ultra-patriotic and waving, sort of owning the issue of Palestine is the path to instant credibility in the Arab world and some other parts of the Muslim world, a little bit beyond that. So you see, for example, Iran, which started flexing its muscles after our rather misguided adventure in Iraq gave them the space to do it, became the champion of Palestine too. Even the whole thing was a public relations exercise designed to get a bunch of Arab Sunnis not to be concerned about the rise of a Persian Shiite power. So everything was Al-Quds, which is Jerusalem in Arabic, Al-Quds Day, Al-Quds Brigade. And Ahmadinejad outbid all the Arab leaders by actually engaging in Holocaust analysis, something no Arab head of government or head of state had ever even come close to doing. And weren't going to do, for that matter. So, he became temporarily the kind of the champion in the minds of some, extreme people. And now, Erdogan, when Turkey turned away from Europe and looked towards the Middle East, they became champions of Palestine with this flotilla business and all this stuff. And everyone tries to use this issue. Al-Qaeda, which doesn't want a Palestinian state, they want to abolish all the states in the Middle East, never did a thing to advance the Palestinian cause, even in their own twisted ideology. Bin Laden always used to rant on and on about Palestine, something he manifestly didn't care about. So it is just, this is why the conflict is so dangerous. It is a megaphone sitting in the middle of the street for any demagogue to pick up and gain instant credibility with millions of people just with words. You don't have to do anything, right? You just have to outbid everybody else. It's a very dangerous situation. This is why President Obama and a huge consensus of the foreign policy, intelligence, and military establishment in the United States believes that the solution that I'm talking about, Israel alongside Palestine in peace and security, is imperative for U.S. national interests, not optional, imperative.
If Abbas is not able to work out an agreement with Netanyahu, who do you see next in line within leadership of the Palestinians?
Oh, I don't know who will replace either of them. I think it's very much up in the air. Who would be the next prime minister of Israel? I don't know.
I was going to ask you that.
Who would be the next Palestinian leader? I don't know.
David?
No, I don't know.
Give us a perspective.
I would say one thing. I would say the Israelis would be very well advised to deal with Abbas and Fayyad, because they are unlikely to find themselves dealing with people as committed to nonviolence and peace in the future. And if it goes on like this, as I said, you'll end up dealing with Hamas, and then it'll be people waving holy books fighting each other over the will of God in holy places, and this is what is called a religio-apocalyptic war. It is a nightmare beyond imagining.
Thank you. David, your perspective on Israel's political environment. Right now, Benjamin Netanyahu has a slim majority. He has a one-person majority in the Knesset. And I know Shimon Peres was at the White House April 5th talking with Obama. There's also, I read in Jerusalem Post that he'd had some discussions with Zippy Livni about a coalition government with Netanyahu, and obviously there's a lot of tension and dislike between Netanyahu and Livni, or apparently. What's your perspective on this leadership, on its longevity? It sounds like that they're going to be able to pretty much fill out the full 4-year term. What's your perspective on that and the coalition that Israel has right now?
Well, there's a very strong leadership in Israel that believes and supports the Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria. Many members of our government are residents of Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria. Our foreign minister lives in the Judea.
I was going to mention that.
And our deputy foreign minister has just published on YouTube a very neat description of Israel's rights to the area of Judea and Samaria that I suggest that everyone see. Mr. Danny Ayalon, his presentation there regarding our control there. This government was elected by the population because of their strong stand for Israel's control of Judea and Samaria. And it's interesting that over the past few weeks, many op-eds in Israel have described the current situation in Israel, that we've brought up two generations of Israelis who not only see Judea and Samaria as a part of the land of Israel, but they see Judea and Samaria as the heartland of the land of Israel.
No. I actually agree with part of what David said, the most important part, which is that Prime Minister Netanyahu has assembled one of the most stable coalitions in the history of Israel. It's remarkable. It's a crazy quilt. Ideologically, it makes no sense. And I don't think it's reasonable to say that it was elected because it supports the settlements. I think there were many parties in it that were elected for different reasons by different constituencies. However, it is certainly a right-of-center government that is pursuing a nationally self-destructive policy of deepening the occupation, digging the hole deeper, making peace more difficult to attain by expanding the constituency that doesn't want to end the occupation and doesn't want to live in peace alongside the Palestinians, but is careening headlong in the direction of this religious war that I've been discussing, or even ethnic war that has been going on and that will probably intensify. You're right about Foreign Minister Lieberman. He is the only foreign minister in the world who does not live in the country he represents.
Well,
and indeed, he does not.
We promised we would finish at 9 o'clock. Thank you for your patience. Sorry we couldn't get to all the questions, but there were some very good ones. And both gentlemen will have a couple minute closing. David started, Hussein, if you could start and David could finish, and then we'll be finished. Thank you very much for being here, and appreciate this opportunity tonight, and thank you for being so polite as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, I really think I've stated it as clearly as I can. There are these competing national narratives, competing religious ideologies, competing everything between two peoples of equal size in a very small area. One party has all the power, the other party has a very small group of them has citizenship in that area, but most of them are non-citizens without rights, etc. You can change the names to Bulgarians and Romanians, Bolivians and Venezuelans. You could move this structure anywhere in the world. Jews, Christian, Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, atheists, animists, it wouldn't matter. This relationship, this structure of dominance and subordination, of oppression, of the systematic denial of the basic rights of millions of people is going to always lead to conflict, even though right now there are leaders on the Palestinian side who are absolutely opposed to any return to violence, and they're working hard to prevent it. In the end, if they don't succeed, they will go. If their policies fail in the long run, they will be replaced, and we know who's standing in the wings, right? Now, what I'm trying to say is that there is only one way out, which will be acceptable to both societies, to the majorities in both societies. And one thing I have not mentioned that I should, is that a large majority of Israelis, at least 60%, in every opinion poll I've seen, is in favor of a negotiated two-state solution, and similar number among Palestinians. Unfortunately, the same majorities don't believe the other side is telling the truth when they say they want it, and they don't think it will happen. In other words, we're talking past each other. Now, there are minorities among the Palestinians in groups like Hamas that don't want to make a deal, and there are people in the occupied Israelis in the occupied territories like David who also don't want to make a deal. They say, this land is mine, it all belongs to me. And I have to tell you, this attitude, which I insist is basically a medieval attitude, will lead us to deeper and deeper levels of carnage and violence. And you know, one of the ways to tell an extremist in this conflict is anyone who says and thinks, time is on my side. I'm going to win in the long run. 60, 70, 80, 100 years from now, I will win. You know what? Time's not on anybody's side. And everybody needs to face the bitter truth that there is always a possibility of a lose-lose scenario. For the Israelis and the Palestinians, everyone can lose everything. And that's what we, friends of Israel and friends of the Palestinians here in the United States, need to help them avoid. And the only way to help them avoid that is to make a reasonable, decent arrangement where each has a state and they live side by side in peace and security like normal societies. Thank you.
Thank you.
First of all, Bill, I'd like to thank you for moderating this event.
Thank you, David.
And Hussein, thank you for speaking with us. This chat was a lot of fun. And thank Hayovel for hosting the event. And thank you all for coming out. In summary, I've already said the Jewish people prayed and believed for 2,000 years that we would return to our homeland. And through the great miracles, we have returned to our homeland and we are establishing ourselves and we're there to stay. We extend our hand in peace to all of our neighbors and all of the non-Jewish residents of Israel. We offer them peace in return for peace. And I pray that they will accept our offer, and I believe that that will come to be. Thank you all.